The desert sun burned hot over Fallujah as Marine Corporal Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet and checked her rifle one more time. She had been in Iraq for 8 months now, but the nervousness before each patrol never went away. At 23, she was one of the few female Marines stationed at the forward operating base, and she had earned the respect of her unit through her sharp shooting skills and unwavering determination. Sarah grew up in a small town in Montana, where her father taught her to hunt and fish. When she turned 18, she surprised everyone by enlisting in the Marines instead of going to college like her parents wanted. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, understood her decision better than anyone else in the family. He had taught her that sometimes you have to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's dangerous. The mission briefing that morning was routine: escort a convoy of supplies to a school that was being rebuilt in the eastern sector of the city. The children there had been without proper books and medical supplies for months. Sarah volunteered for these missions because she believed they were making a real difference in the lives of ordinary Iraqi families who just wanted peace. Her squad consisted of 8 Marines, including Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become like a big brother to her. Rodriguez always made sure Sarah was positioned safely during patrols, but he also knew she could handle herself in any situation. The other Marines had initially been skeptical about having a woman in their unit, but Sarah had proven herself time and again. As they loaded into the armored vehicles, Sarah thought about the letter she had written to her younger sister back home. She had told her about the Iraqi children who would run up to their convoy, smiling and waving despite the chaos around them. These moments reminded her why she was there, not just as a soldier but as someone who wanted to help rebuild a broken country. The convoy rolled out at dawn, with Sarah's vehicle in the middle position. The streets of Fallujah were eerily quiet, which always made the Marines nervous. Usually there would be some civilians visible, going about their daily routines. But today the streets seemed almost abandoned. Sarah noticed this immediately and mentioned it to Rodriguez over the radio. The first part of their route went smoothly. They passed through 2 checkpoints without incident and were making good time toward the school. Sarah was scanning the rooftops through her scope when she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. There were fresh tire tracks in the sand that hadn't been there during their last patrol 3 days ago. She quickly reported this to her squad leader, who decided to take an alternate route to avoid any potential ambush. This decision would later save the lives of most of her unit, but it would also lead Sarah into the most dangerous situation of her life. As they turned down a narrow street lined with damaged buildings, none of them could have predicted what was waiting for them just ahead. The school they were headed to had been built by American forces as part of the reconstruction effort. Local contractors had worked alongside Marines to create a safe place where children could learn and grow. Sarah had visited the school before and had seen the hope in the teachers' eyes. She carried pictures that the children had drawn for her, including one that showed her in her Marine uniform with the words "Thank you" written in both English and Arabic. As their convoy approached the final checkpoint before reaching the school, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and caution that came with every mission. She had learned to trust her instincts during her time in Iraq, and something about today felt different. The silence in the streets was too complete, too perfect. Even the stray dogs that usually roamed the area were nowhere to be seen. Rodriguez noticed her tension and gave her a reassuring nod over the radio. He had been in Iraq for 2 tours, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. If he wasn't worried, then maybe she was just being paranoid. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from the shadows of the damaged buildings that lined their route. The armored vehicle rumbled forward, its heavy engine echoing off the concrete walls around them. Sarah continued her careful scan of the area, looking for anything out of place. A glint of metal, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, or movement in a window. Her training had taught her that survival often depended on noticing the smallest details that others might miss. The explosion came without warning. One moment Sarah was scanning the rooftops, and the next moment her world turned into chaos and fire. The improvised explosive device had been hidden in a pile of rubble that looked like typical war debris. The blast lifted the front of their armored vehicle into the air and sent it crashing down on its side. Sarah's ears were ringing so loudly she couldn't hear anything else. Her vision was blurry and she could taste blood in her mouth. She tried to move but realized she was hanging upside down, held in place by her safety harness. The smell of smoke and burning fuel filled the vehicle, and she knew they had to get out quickly before it caught fire. Through the chaos, she could hear Rodriguez shouting orders to the rest of the squad. At least he was alive. Sarah managed to unbuckle her harness and drop down to what was now the ceiling of the overturned vehicle. Her left shoulder was screaming with pain, but she could still move her arm. That was a good sign. The vehicle's rear door was jammed shut from the impact. Sarah could hear gunfire outside, which meant the ambush was just beginning. The insurgents had planned this carefully. First disable their vehicle with the explosion, then attack while they were trapped and confused. It was a common tactic that had worked too many times before. Rodriguez appeared beside her, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. He was trying to force open the door while keeping low to avoid the bullets that were starting to punch through the armor plating. The vehicle had been designed to withstand small arms fire, but it wasn't meant to protect them while lying on its side. Other Marines from the convoy were returning fire, trying to keep the attackers at bay while their trapped squad mates escaped. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of American M4 rifles mixed with the sharper crack of AK-47s. The battle was intense and close, probably taking place across a distance of less than 50 yards. Finally, Rodriguez managed to kick the door open. Sarah grabbed her rifle and followed him out into the street. Immediately, bullets began hitting the pavement around them, sending up small explosions of concrete dust. They ran toward a partially destroyed building that would provide cover, but Sarah felt something hit her in the back with tremendous force. She stumbled but kept running. The body armor had absorbed most of the impact, but the bullet had still knocked the wind out of her. Rodriguez grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a concrete barrier just as more shots rang out. They were safe for the moment, but their situation was getting worse by the minute. Looking around, Sarah counted only 4 other Marines from their squad who had made it to cover. That meant at least 3 were either dead or seriously wounded back at the vehicle. The thought made her angry rather than afraid. These were her brothers, her family, and someone was going to pay for hurting them. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The insurgents had positioned themselves in buildings on both sides of the street, creating a deadly crossfire. Every time the Marines tried to move, bullets would force them back behind cover. They were pinned down with limited ammunition and no immediate backup. Sarah's training took over. She began identifying the enemy positions by watching for muzzle flashes and listening to the direction of the shots. There were at least 6 different firing positions, which meant they were outnumbered 2 to 1. The odds weren't good, but they had been in worse situations before. Rodriguez was on the radio, calling for backup and medical evacuation. But Sarah knew it would take at least 30 minutes for help to arrive, and they might not last that long. Their ammunition was running low, and the insurgents seemed to have plenty of bullets and time. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She spotted a route to the building where most of the enemy fire was coming from. It was dangerous and would require running across open ground, but if she could get close enough, she might be able to take out several of the attackers and give her squad a chance to escape. She explained her plan to Rodriguez, who immediately shook his head. It was too risky, he said. They should wait for backup. But Sarah pointed out that they might all be dead by the time help arrived. Someone had to do something, and she was the best shot in their unit. Before Rodriguez could stop her, Sarah sprinted from their cover toward the enemy building. Bullets immediately began hitting the ground around her feet, but she kept running. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of all those hunting trips where he had taught her to stay calm under pressure. She made it to the base of the building and began climbing the stairs, her heart pounding from adrenaline and exertion. She could hear the insurgents above her, shouting to each other in Arabic. They knew she was coming, which meant she had lost the element of surprise. But there was no turning back now. Sarah reached the 2nd floor and carefully peered around a corner. She could see 3 men with rifles positioned at windows firing down at her squad. She took a deep breath, aimed carefully, and began to return fire. Her first shot found its target, and one of the attackers fell. The other 2 turned toward her, and that's when everything went wrong. The first bullet hit Sarah in the chest, slamming into her body armor with the force of a sledgehammer. She stumbled backward but managed to stay on her feet and return fire. Her shot took down the second attacker, but more insurgents were already rushing up the stairs behind her. She was trapped between enemies above and below. Sarah dove into a small room and slammed the door shut. It wouldn't hold them for long. but it gave her a few seconds to assess her situation. Her chest ached from the bullet impact, but the armor had done its job. She could still breathe and fight. More importantly, she could hear that the gunfire outside had decreased, which meant her attack had given her squad the distraction they needed. The door exploded inward as insurgents tried to force their way into the room. Sarah was ready for them. Her rifle barked 3 times in quick succession and the attackers fell, but the noise had given away her position to everyone in the building. She could hear boots running on the stairs and angry voices shouting orders. She moved to the window and looked down at the street. Rodriguez and the other Marines were using the confusion to advance toward better positions. Her plan was working, but she was now completely surrounded. There was no way out of the building and more enemies were coming up the stairs every minute. A grenade rolled into the room and Sarah threw herself behind an overturned table just as it exploded. The blast filled the air with smoke and debris and her ears started ringing again. Shrapnel had torn through her left leg and she could feel warm blood soaking through her uniform. But she was still alive and still fighting. Through the smoke, she saw 3 more insurgents entering the room. Sarah's rifle was empty, so she drew her sidearm and began firing. Her shots were accurate despite her injuries, and 2 of the attackers went down. The third one managed to get close enough to tackle her to the ground. They wrestled for control of her pistol while rolling across the debris-covered floor. The insurgent was bigger and stronger, but Sarah's training gave her an advantage. She managed to get her knee up and drove it into his ribs with all her strength. He loosened his grip just enough for her to break free and put 2 bullets in his chest. Sarah struggled to her feet, bleeding from multiple wounds but still determined to fight. She reloaded her pistol and checked her rifle. 2 bullets left in the magazine and 1 more magazine in her vest. After that, she would have to rely on her knife and her bare hands. The gunfire outside was getting closer, which meant her squad was advancing. But Sarah could also hear more insurgents entering the building from different directions. They were coordinating their attack now, and she was running out of time and ammunition. She moved to a different window and saw Rodriguez leading 2 Marines up the street toward her building. They were trying to reach her, but enemy fire was keeping them pinned down behind a burned-out car. Sarah knew she had to help them, even if it meant exposing herself to more enemy fire. Using her rifle scope, she began picking off insurgents who were shooting at her squad from other buildings. Her aim was perfect despite her injuries and the chaos around her. 1 shot, 1 kill. That had always been her motto, and it served her well now. But while she was focused on helping her squad, more enemies had reached her floor. Sarah heard them in the hallway outside her room, speaking in hushed tones as they planned their final assault. She positioned herself behind the overturned table and waited. When they rushed through the doorway, Sarah was ready. Her rifle spoke twice and 2 more attackers fell. But her magazine was empty now and there were still more coming. She drew her pistol again and continued fighting, but the odds were overwhelming. A bullet caught her in the right shoulder, spinning her around and sending her pistol flying across the room. Another shot hit her in the thigh, dropping her to 1 knee. She could feel her strength fading as blood loss began to take its toll. But Sarah Mitchell had never surrendered in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. She pulled out her combat knife and prepared for hand-to-hand combat. The insurgent seemed surprised by her determination. Even wounded and bleeding, she looked dangerous and ready to fight to the death. They approached carefully, knowing that a cornered Marine was still extremely dangerous. Sarah lunged at the closest attacker, driving her knife deep into his chest. But the effort cost her the last of her strength and she collapsed to the floor. More bullets found their mark, hitting her in the arm and side. The pain was incredible, but she forced herself to stay conscious. The insurgents were shouting at each other now, probably deciding what to do with their wounded prisoner. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could guess their meaning. They would either kill her quickly or take her captive for propaganda purposes. Neither option appealed to her. Using the last of her strength, Sarah rolled toward her fallen pistol. If she was going to die, she wanted to go down fighting. But before she could reach the weapon, another bullet hit her in the back. The impact drove her face first into the concrete floor, and everything went black. When Sarah regained consciousness, the building was silent. Her watch showed that she had been unconscious for almost an hour. The insurgents were gone, probably retreating when they heard American reinforcements approaching. But they had left her for dead, bleeding on the floor of a destroyed building in the heart of enemy territory. Sarah tried to move but immediately regretted it. Pain shot through her body like lightning and she could taste blood in her mouth. She did a quick mental inventory of her injuries, bullet wounds in her shoulder, thigh, arm, side, and back. She had lost a lot of blood and her left leg wasn't responding properly, but she was alive, and that meant she still had a chance. The sound of distant gunfire told her the battle was still going on, but it seemed to be moving away from her location. Rodriguez and the others were probably fighting their way through the city, trying to complete their mission while also searching for her. She knew they wouldn't leave without her, but she also knew they might not find her in time. Sarah forced herself to sit up, using the wall for support. The movement made her dizzy, and she had to wait several minutes for her vision to clear. She looked around the room, taking in the bodies of the insurgents she had killed. Even wounded and outnumbered, she had fought like the Marine she was trained to be. Her rifle was broken, destroyed by shrapnel from the grenade explosion. Her pistol was somewhere across the room, but she wasn't sure she had the strength to crawl over and get it. Instead, she focused on more immediate concerns, stopping the bleeding and finding water. Using strips torn from her uniform, Sarah managed to create makeshift bandages for her worst wounds. The bullet in her shoulder had gone clean through, which was good news. The one in her thigh had missed the major arteries, or she would already be dead. Her arm was mostly numb, but she could still move her fingers. The bullet in her back was the most concerning. She couldn't reach it to examine the wound, but she could feel blood running down her spine. The fact that she could still move her legs meant it probably hadn't hit her spinal cord. But she was getting weaker by the hour. Sarah found a partially full bottle of water in one of the dead insurgents' pockets. She drank it slowly, forcing herself to save some for later. She also found a few pieces of flatbread and some dates. It wasn't much, but it would help her maintain her strength for a little while longer. As night fell over Fallujah, the temperature began to drop. Sarah had always been tough, but losing blood made her feel cold despite the desert heat. She wrapped herself in a curtain she found hanging in the window and tried to get comfortable. Sleep was dangerous. She might not wake up, but her body desperately needed rest. She dozed fitfully through the night, waking frequently to the sound of gunfire and explosions in the distance. Sometimes the sound seemed closer, and she would grip her knife tightly, ready to fight if the insurgents returned. But each time the sounds faded away, leaving her alone with her pain and her thoughts. Sarah thought about her family back home in Montana. Her parents would be watching the news, worried sick about reports of fighting in Iraq. Her little sister would be checking her email constantly, hoping for a message that never came. Her father would understand the risks she had taken. He had been in combat himself, but that wouldn't make the waiting any easier. She also thought about Rodriguez and the other Marines in her unit. Had they completed their mission? Were they safe? How many of them had been killed or wounded in the ambush? These thoughts tormented her more than her physical pain. Her squad was her family, and not knowing their fate was agony. The second day was worse than the first. Sarah's wounds were showing signs of infection, and her fever was climbing. She was having trouble staying awake, and when she did sleep, she had vivid nightmares about the battle. Sometimes she woke up thinking she was still fighting, reaching for weapons that weren't there. She had finished the water the night before, and thirst was becoming a serious problem. Sarah knew that dehydration would kill her faster than her wounds if she didn't find more water soon, but she was too weak to go looking for it, and moving around would only make her bleeding worse. Late in the afternoon, she heard vehicles approaching. Sarah forced herself to crawl to the window and peer out carefully. What she saw made her heart sink. Insurgents were returning to the area, probably to search for weapons or bodies. If they came back to this building, they would find her. She managed to drag herself into a corner where the shadows were deepest and pulled debris over her body. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it was the best she could do. Her knife was in her hand, ready for one last fight if necessary. She had always promised herself that she would never be taken alive by enemy forces. The insurgents entered the building and began searching the lower floors. Sarah could hear them moving around, talking in low voices. They seemed to be taking their time, which meant they weren't in any hurry. Eventually, they would search every room, including hers. Footsteps on the stairs told her they were coming to her floor. Sarah tried to control her breathing and remain completely still. Even the slightest movement might give her away. The fever was making her shake, but she forced her muscles to relax despite the pain. The insurgents entered her room and began examining the bodies of their dead comrades. They spoke angrily to each other. probably discussing how so many of their fighters had been killed by a single American soldier. Sarah understood enough Arabic to catch a few words. They were looking for the Marine who had caused so much damage. One of them walked right past her hiding place without seeing her. Sarah held her breath and gripped her knife tighter. If they discovered her, she would try to take at least one of them with her. But after several tense minutes, they moved on to search other rooms. As darkness fell again, Sarah realized she had survived another day. But she was getting weaker, and she knew her time was running out. She had maybe one more day before blood loss and dehydration would claim her life. If help didn't come soon, she would die alone in this destroyed building, far from home and family. By the morning of the third day, Sarah was barely conscious. Her fever had spiked during the night, and she was having difficulty telling the difference between reality and hallucinations. Sometimes she thought she could hear her father's voice calling her name. Other times she imagined Rodriguez was sitting beside her, telling her that help was on the way. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and her wounds had begun to smell of infection. Sarah knew these were bad signs, but she was beyond caring about medical concerns. All that mattered now was holding on long enough to see another sunrise, and then maybe another one after that. She had stopped trying to move or change position. Every movement brought waves of agony, and she needed to conserve what little energy she had left. Instead, she lay still and listened to the sounds of the city around her. Somewhere out there, people were going about their daily lives unaware that an American Marine was dying slowly in a ruined building. The sound of helicopters in the distance caught her attention. Sarah forced herself to focus, trying to determine if they were American or Iraqi aircraft. The rhythm of the rotors sounded familiar. She thought they might be Blackhawks, but she couldn't be sure. Her hearing had been affected by all the explosions and gunfire. As the hours passed, the helicopter sound seemed to be getting closer. Sarah began to hope that maybe, somehow, her squad had convinced command to send a search and rescue mission. But she also knew that the military didn't usually risk valuable aircraft and crews to look for individual soldiers in hostile territory. Around midday, she heard something that made her heart race, the distinctive sound of American voices. They were still far away, but she could make out English words carried on the desert wind. Sarah tried to call out, but her throat was too dry and damaged to produce more than a weak whisper. The voices were getting closer, and now she could hear boots on pavement. Multiple sets of boots moving with the careful precision of trained soldiers. Sarah gathered every bit of strength she had left and managed to knock over a piece of debris. The small sound echoed in the empty building. Within minutes, she heard footsteps on the stairs. These weren't the casual footsteps of insurgents. These were the measured, cautious steps of professional soldiers clearing a building. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Could it really be a rescue team? The footsteps reached her floor and began moving down the hallway. Sarah could hear low voices speaking in English, coordinating their search. She tried again to call out, and this time she managed to produce a sound that was barely audible even to herself. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway of her room. He was wearing desert camouflage and carrying an advanced rifle that she didn't recognize. His gear looked different from standard Marine equipment, more sophisticated and expensive. As he scanned the room, his eyes passed right over her hiding place. Sarah used the last of her strength to move her hand slightly. The movement caught the soldier's attention, and he spun toward her position with his weapon ready. When he saw her condition, he immediately lowered his rifle and spoke into his radio. "I've got her. Building 3, second floor northeast room. She's alive but in bad shape. I need a medic up here now." The soldier approached carefully, keeping his weapon ready in case of ambush. When he reached Sarah's hiding place, he knelt down and began examining her wounds. His touch was gentle but professional, and she could see concern in his eyes behind his tactical goggles. "Marine, can you hear me? My name is Chief Petty Officer Thompson. We're here to get you out." Sarah tried to speak but could only nod weakly. Thompson was a Navy SEAL, she realized. That explained the different equipment and the confident way he moved. SEALs were the best of the best, and if they had come looking for her, it meant her squad had convinced someone very high up the chain of command to authorize this mission. 2 more SEALs entered the room, followed by a Navy corpsman carrying a medical bag. The medic immediately began working on Sarah's wounds, starting an IV line and checking her vital signs. His movements were quick and efficient, honed by treating wounded soldiers in combat zones around the world. "How long has she been here?" asked one of the SEALs. Based on the blood loss and dehydration, I'd say at least 2 days, maybe 3, replied the corpsman. She's tough as nails to have survived this long with these injuries. Thompson was on his radio again, calling for immediate medical evacuation. Sarah could hear the urgency in his voice, and she realized her condition was even worse than she had thought. But she was also filled with overwhelming relief. She was going to live. After 3 days of hell, she was finally going home. The corpsman had given her something for the pain, and Sarah felt a warm numbness spreading through her body. For the first time in days, the constant agony began to fade. She tried to thank the SEALs, but the medication was making her drowsy. "Don't try to talk, Marine," said Thompson. "You've done enough. Just rest now. We're going to get you out of here." Within minutes, Sarah could hear the sound of helicopters approaching. The SEALs had called in a medical evacuation chopper, complete with a full surgical team. She was going to receive the best possible care from the moment she left the building until she reached a military hospital. 2 SEALs carefully lifted Sarah onto a stretcher while the corpsman continued monitoring her condition. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body despite the medication, but she bit down hard and refused to cry out. She was a Marine, and Marines didn't complain about pain. As they carried her toward the stairs, Sarah caught a glimpse of the insurgents she had killed during the battle. The sight filled her with grim satisfaction. She had been outnumbered and outgunned, but she had never stopped fighting. Even when death seemed certain, she had refused to give up. The helicopter ride to the field hospital was a blur of medical activity and mechanical noise. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as the flight medics worked to stabilize her condition. She could hear urgent voices discussing blood pressure, pulse rate, and surgical procedures, but the words seemed to come from very far away. When she woke up again, she was in a clean hospital bed surrounded by white walls and the steady beeping of medical monitors. Her body was wrapped in bandages, and tubes and wires connected her to various machines. The pain was still there, but it was manageable now thanks to proper medication. A doctor approached her bed, a kind-faced woman with captain's bars on her uniform. She explained that Sarah had undergone emergency surgery to remove the bullets and repair the damage to her internal organs. The prognosis was good, but she would need months of physical therapy to regain full use of her left arm and leg. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw that Sarah was awake. He had a bandage wrapped around his head and his arm was in a sling, but he was alive and smiling. Behind him stood 2 other Marines from their squad, both looking tired but relieved. "You crazy fool," Rodriguez said, tears in his eyes. "We thought we lost you. When we couldn't find you after the battle, I convinced the colonel to authorize a search mission. Those SEALs spent 2 days looking for you." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was still too damaged. The doctor handed her a pad of paper and a pen. With shaking hands, she wrote, "Did we complete the mission?" Rodriguez nodded. "The supplies made it to the school. The kids are getting their books and medicine just like we planned. And Sarah, what you did in that building saved all our lives. The brass is talking about putting you in for a medal." Sarah wrote another note. "How many did we lose?" Rodriguez's expression became more serious. "Thompson and Garcia didn't make it. They died in the vehicle when the IED went off. But the rest of us are alive because of what you did. You drew their fire and gave us the chance to fight back." The news about Thompson and Garcia hit Sarah hard. She had served with both men for months and they had become close friends. The fact that her actions had saved the others didn't make their deaths any easier to accept. War always extracted a price and good soldiers always paid it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's condition improved steadily. The infection in her wounds responded to antibiotics and her strength began to return. Physical therapists worked with her daily, helping her regain movement in her damaged limbs. The process was slow and often painful, but she attacked it with the same determination she had shown in combat. News of her survival and heroism had reached the media back home. Her parents received calls from reporters wanting to interview them about their daughter's actions. The story of the Marine who had taken 15 bullets and survived 3 days alone in enemy territory captured the public imagination. Sarah received hundreds of letters from Americans thanking her for her service and expressing admiration for her courage. Children from the school where she had been delivering supplies sent her drawings and letters written in broken English. These messages meant more to her than any official recognition. The Purple Heart ceremony took place in the hospital courtyard, with Sarah in a wheelchair due to her ongoing recovery. The commanding general pinned the medal to her hospital gown while her parents, who had flown in from Montana, watched with tears of pride and relief. Rodriguez and the other survivors from her squad stood at attention nearby. In his speech, the general spoke about courage under fire and the warrior spirit that defined the Marine Corps. He said that Sarah's actions embodied the Marine motto of Semper Fidelis, always faithful. She had remained faithful to her mission, her squad, and her country even when facing almost certain death. Sarah was eventually transferred to a military hospital in Germany for more advanced treatment, and then finally to a veterans medical center in the United States. The journey home took 3 months, but each step brought her closer to full recovery. The physical scars would remain with her forever. She would always walk with a slight limp, and her left arm would never regain complete strength. But the deeper wounds were healing too. The nightmares came less frequently, and she was learning to live with the memories of what she had experienced. A year later, Sarah stood on the stage at her little sister's high school graduation. She was in her dress blue uniform, wearing her Purple Heart and several other medals she had earned during her service. The students gave her a standing ovation when she was introduced as a local hero. In her speech to the graduating class, Sarah talked about the importance of serving something greater than yourself. She told them about the Iraqi children who had drawn pictures for her, and about the Marines who had died so that others could live. She explained that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. After leaving the Marine Corps, Sarah used her GI Bill benefits to attend college and study international relations. She wanted to work in diplomacy and conflict resolution, using her understanding of war to help prevent future conflicts. Her professors were amazed by the insight and maturity she brought to discussions about military strategy and foreign policy. Rodriguez stayed in touch, and they met regularly to honor the memory of Thompson and Garcia. They would visit the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., where Rodriguez's father's name was engraved, and talk about the friends they had lost and the experiences that had shaped their lives. Sarah eventually married a fellow veteran she met in college, and they started a family together. She told her children stories about their grandfather's service in Vietnam and about the importance of standing up for what you believe in. She taught them to shoot and hunt, just as her father had taught her, but she also taught them about the terrible cost of war. The building in Fallujah where Sarah had made her stand was eventually demolished as part of the reconstruction effort. A school was built on the site, and a small plaque was installed commemorating the Marines who had fought and died there. Sarah returned to Iraq 10 years later as part of a diplomatic mission, and she was able to visit the school and meet some of the children who were benefiting from the sacrifice she and her fellow Marines had made.